I'm so excited to welcome in some of the champions of Houston sports. We've got the greatest champion, Carl Lewis. We've got Mario Elie, of course, who's a Clutch City hero. We've got Bill Worrell, who's been with the Rockets and U of H champion for years and years and years. And of course, myself, you can see behind me, I've got my Rockets jersey and a USA jersey as well. But we have the real champion here, Chris Hollins, who is helping us all keep our right to vote, which is critical in our democracy. And that's why we're all here today, is so that we can all talk about how important it is for voting rights, especially in the state of Texas, but throughout the United States, how important it is for us to fight for our voting rights, how important it is for us to continue to try to make our country a more inclusive democracy. And so, Chris, really glad to have you on here as well.
It's my pleasure.
So let's get started really by talking about maybe Carl, if you have a story about voter suppression in your family, or any sort of discrimination that you felt going to the polls or anything like that.
Well, I have a unique perspective. First of all, I was born in Birmingham in 1961. My parents actually met Dr. King back in the mid-1950s. And so they were involved in the bus strike because we had a car. So when I was raised in the 60s in New Jersey, I was raised on stories of them marching for voting rights, them marching for civil rights. The little girls that were killed in the bombing, they were family friends. Rosa Parks was a mother's friend. So I was raised with that sense of pride, but also in a town, Willingboro, New Jersey, which had a Civil Rights Housing Act lawsuit. It was an old Levitt town. So civil rights, and it was always a part of our conversation at the dinner table. And then my parents started a track club in the late 1960s because my mother wanted girls to have access. So it was a thing about women, empowering women. It was about people of color, understanding how important it was to have the right to vote, because when they were growing up, they were totally denied that. And then because of their education, they couldn't deny them then, but they were part of the marches and everything else in order to get the Voting Rights Act in 1964, I believe. So that's my little story to start.
Well, that's quite the history too. And Bill, you've been around for years and years and years, and you've seen it all. And maybe you can kind of give us some flavor from that era when you were going to the University of Houston.
Yeah, I like the way you say years and years and years, Matt. I'm older than most of the trees in Houston right now, but I have seen it all. And what's incredible to me is that here we are in 2021 talking about suppression of the vote, because I went to the University of Houston in 1962 was my first year. I was a freshman. I came from a segregated school in Houston, Lamar High School. So when I was at Lamar, in order to get better playing basketball and other sports and whatever I did, we'd have to go over to the University of Houston campus, where all the kids from Yates and Worthing and all the good basketball players would play, so we could really learn the game. And that was the first time that I really came in contact with Black people and kids my age who were of a different color. And I've always said this to people, I still say it to them now, you cannot know a person until you get to meet them and know what's inside of them. And so many of the young kids that I met back then, the only difference in us, as I found out, were just the colors of our skin. We all strived for the same thing. We all wanted the same thing. We all wanted the freedom. But I understood at the time that I was a little more free than they were to express my opinion and to give my vote in whatever it was. And the first time I can remember really getting involved was when Reverend Lawson at the Baptist Church right off campus, Wheeler Street Baptist Church, brought Dr. King to Houston. And Dr. King was part of a movement. He came with Jesse Jackson and a lot of other folks and spoke here. And he was speaking at the time about not only the right to vote, but by protesting, not only protesting, but boycotting. And Dr. King said at the time, if we could get the major companies to do their part, and now I see that that's the same process that people are talking about now, and we're talking about over 50 years ago. So this is incredible to me that it's lasted this long, that we're still talking about giving people equality, giving people the right to vote. Why shouldn't it be easier for us to vote? Why don't we pass laws to make it easier to vote rather than harder to vote? I still don't get it. And maybe we can hash that out
Well,
here.
and Bill, you're right. It is, it's incredible, and it's depressing that we're still fighting for the right to vote. And it's bad here in Texas. Texas is one of the most voting suppressed states in the nation. And I'll give you a little, my daughter lives in Washington State. And in Washington State, they send a ballot to every single citizen of that state. And they send a little pamphlet that each candidate running for office gets to write a little blurb about what they're running for and what they stand for. And so you can sit at home in Washington State and do your research and fill out your ballot. And then you go drop it in a secure ballot box, and everybody then gets a chance to vote on their own time. And so I've seen what it's like in a different state. But, you know, Chris, here in Texas, the voting suppression is off the charts, and you've done a lot to try to combat that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I grew up in a slightly different era than you gentlemen. But, my parents, we're a mixed race household. I have a Black father and a white mother. And when they were growing up in the 50s and 60s, their lives and their experiences were a lot different. And by the time that they met and married one another in the 80s, of course, getting married was legal, which it hadn't been just years before. It wasn't necessarily as accepted. But, we continue to progress. And, I was shielded from a lot of the challenges that my father faced as a student at Jack Yates High School in the 60s. And as we've, again, moved even further forward, and we've seen a Black president and so many other developments, rights for gay and lesbian and transgender Americans and so forth. That's been a really great development. But now in the last few years, we've seen sort of a backlash, a retraction. And then especially now after the results of the 2020 election, what we've seen across the country, but only here in brown people and these young people vote, that's a problem. Because they're putting folks in place who don't represent the old guard or the way that it used to be, and so let's make it harder for them to vote, and that's awful, right? In 2020 here in Harris County, and Matt, you said it, Texas was already and remains the hardest place for it to vote in the country. But here in Harris County, we did whatever we could to make sure that the 2.5 million registered voters in this county could cast their ballots and could do so safely during the time of COVID-19, but could also do so conveniently and do so with the peace of mind that their votes would be counted, because that's what it's all about. It's about our community coming together, each of us, making our own choice of who to support, and then we go with the winner, plain and simple. And that's how democracy works or should work. So we had things like drive-through voting, where everyone could vote from the safety and convenience of their vehicles. We had extended hours, 24-hour voting even. So our doctors and nurses who've been working so hard during this pandemic on back-to-back shifts, our electricians and welders who are working at the Port of Houston, not getting off until midnight, 2 a.m., our first responders, our firefighters who clock in on a regular day at 5 and 6 in the morning, giving those people on one occasion the opportunity to vote at a time that's convenient for them. And that's what it should be about. If you're a citizen in this country, if you have the right to vote, it should be as simple and straightforward and safe for you to vote, period, as much as we can make it. But these laws that are coming out right now do the exact opposite. It makes it harder for everyone to vote, but it particularly targets Black and brown people, people of color, people in disadvantaged communities, and younger and poorer people. And that, again, is the exact opposite of what we should be trying to do in this country, is to take away the voice of folks who already are underrepresented so much. And so it's a real travesty. And I'm so glad that you gentlemen have taken the time to come and talk about this this afternoon.
Well, one of the things that I'm proud of being part of the NBA is the NBA stood up. Remember when the NBA went into the bubble during the pandemic to play games, and we put Black Lives Matter on the floor, and the NBA stood up as an entity, all of us together standing up and saying, hey, look, things are going on in this country aren't right. We can all see them plainly and clearly with our eyes. We can hear it with our ears. We see the obvious racism, the obvious voter suppression, and it's not right. And we need to do something about it. And so a lot of NBA arenas opened up. The Toyota Center here in Houston opened up so that thousands of people could come and vote easily and safely. And so I'm very proud to be a part of the NBA because we're trying to be a part of the solution. But it's still going on. And I think one of the bills that may pass here in Texas might make it illegal to vote in Toyota Center, which is a travesty for sure. And so I think all of us continue to need to fight. And maybe Mario, if you have anything to any experience or anything to add about being part of the NBA, we'd love to hear it.
Very proud of you, Bull. Appreciate you reaching out to me. And I just, my family, my family came from Haiti, and we migrated here to New York City. And this is the greatest country in the world. It allowed opportunity for my whole family to come over here and succeed in life. And the number one right we do have is to vote who we want in office. And what they're doing down here in Texas is just criminal. It's just criminal. And then you mentioned it, Bull. It's our right to vote. That's what's great thing about the United States. It's a democracy. It's our right to vote. And seeing these politicians here trying to take away our right to vote, that's why I had to join the call with you, with these great individuals, Carl Lewis, Tony, yourself. I love what you guys are doing. I have a social media platform, and I for sure Tony will go on my social media platform to let everybody know what the hell is going on, which is not right. They're trying to take the right of African Americans mostly to vote, which is not right. So I'm gonna do whatever I can to help, change the narrative here. And you're right, I got kids, I got triplets, 17 years old, and I want them to have the right to vote for the person they want in office, So I appreciate all you guys stepping up. I'm here for the fight with you guys, and whatever you need me to do, I'm gonna do it. Because I just think this is not right. It's going on all over the country in different states, of course, in the Republican states, Arizona, here in Texas. So we gotta try to make a change. And Tony said it right. These big companies got to step up. Southwest Airlines, all the airlines got to step up. HEB. I mean, we're the fourth largest state. We're the fourth largest city here in Houston. So I think we can make a lot of noise. So that's what I'm here for. I'm here to contribute. And I like what all you guys are doing, because a lot of people are not aware of what's going on. And Bull, I appreciate you with the emails, with the texts, keeping me up to date on what's going on. And people need to know this information.
Yeah, Mario, one of the greatest things in our lifetime is that you and I were teammates on a championship team. And we bonded together as brothers because we went through the fights together. We went through the fires together. We went through the down times together, and we stuck together. And we all pulled in the right direction. And so the Houston Rockets in '94, '95, under Hall of Famer Rudy Tomjanovich, we learned the lessons of how important it is to be good teammates of each other and to fight for each other. And if you do that, you can be champions. And so, Mario, I'm so appreciative of you. And the experiences that we've had together in our lifetimes are unmatched, and it's great. So thanks for joining this. And hey, let's send it to Carl. And Carl, what do you have to say?
And we all know it's really simply about holding on to power and keeping America the way they want it to be and idealize it. And what's so sad about the whole thing is that it's so obvious. We can see it, and they've gotten to where they simply don't even care if you know that's exactly what they're doing to keep their power. And for years and years and years, it was dog whistles, and dog whistles don't exist anymore. It's just, we just don't care. We're going to say it. And it just surprises me that it's just become so obvious and easy for them to just ignore things that are really so important and so obvious to the rest of us. And when it really comes to voting, what's interesting to me is how we've fought this long time to try to overturn it. If you go back, I mean, overturn all these rules and regulations. And in Texas, it is extremely hard, as you mentioned earlier, to vote. And you're talking about a state that they know that if that state is flipped, then there's really almost no path to the presidency for the party. So it's pretty obvious what's going on now. And now I think not only, do we have to fight and also push our corporations who are supporting these kind of things. It's not just enough, like they are in Georgia, to say, well, we are not for this. They're actually going to have to put that into action, just like the NBA put it into action in these organizations, or else it will not change. Because it's easy to say, well, we're just going to say we're against it and then kind of let it go. But they actually have to put it into action. And the NBA is a perfect example of how you could use your power and influence to get something done.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Carl. If you look back through history, and I was a political science major in college, so I learned the history of this country, in college. And you can see, back in the Jim Crow era, what was done is wrong. We can clearly look back on the civil rights era, and we can see, when John Lewis was marching across the Pettus Bridge, when he was beaten, that was clearly wrong. And so we all wonder, like, if we lived back in those days, what would we have been doing? Well, what you would have been doing back in those days is exactly what you're doing today. And if you don't stand up today for what's right in this country, if you don't stand up today for all men and women are created equal, well, then, you're not really helping.
Yeah, Matt, you go back to a time that I lived through, of course, when I was at the University of Houston. And I was so proud at the time of our Texas Senator Lyndon Johnson, who was vice president. President Kennedy was assassinated. I was working out there at the U of H when that happened, walking across campus. And I was wondering what was going to happen to a lot of the proposals that had gone before Congress. And because of Lyndon Johnson, and he was able to strong arm some of the Democrats in the South, and was able to push through the civil rights legislation and the voting rights legislation. And we thought finally that was going to be what was going to pass and be the rule of the country. But that's been worked back a little bit by the Republican administrations that we have had. And I noticed just recently now, I think it was yesterday or today, that the Texas politicians have now ruled that the Voting Rights Act will be harder because more of these things will be put in. I think the bill to restrict the voting in Texas was put in by a senator from Mineola, Texas. And this is where Texas politics has always been controlled by the counties and the smaller cities. And your big cities like Houston and Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, they don't get the representation that is needed. And they're the cities that take the brunt of these bills that are passed to prevent voting. And that's what's tough. I think if the cities could get control of the Texas legislature, then I think fair and more equitable treatment of the voting programs would happen.
Yeah, and Bill, let me just piggyback on what you said, going back to, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated and LBJ became president, and Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother, to paraphrase something that he said that I think is very important, RFK said, "All men make mistakes, but a good man yields and changes course when he realizes his mistake." And so maybe, Chris, you can tell us, what are some of the things that we can do now here in 2021 for those of us who are realizing, hey, this isn't right, this is a mistake, we need to make this better? What can we do?
Absolutely. No, it's a great question. I want to just touch on a couple of things. You talked about the Voting Rights Act, Bill, and that was passed by Lyndon Johnson, a proud Texan, who also happened to be a Democrat. But this wasn't a Democratic proposal. The Voting Rights Act was renewed for years and years and years by Democrats and Republicans alike, all the way through to Ronald Reagan, and then all the way through to the additional Texans, George Bush, 41, and George Bush, 43. And so this has been bipartisan legislation that's purely about democracy. No matter your political stripe, your color, what language you speak, where you're from, how old you are, you should have a basic set of rights to access the ballot. And until very recently, that hasn't been a controversial issue, whatsoever. I also just want to talk a bit just specifically, because folks might say, hey, y'all are talking about this stuff going on in Texas. Well, what's actually in these laws, these bills? And so I'll share just a few examples. And, I mentioned some of the great things we did in Harris County in 2020, like drive-through voting, where we had that at the Toyota Center as well, and extended hours, 24-hour voting. These bills would make both of those things illegal. Another thing that we did last year, our senior citizens who were most susceptible to the coronavirus. If you're over the age of 65, then you have the right in Texas to vote by mail. Now, in other states, 2/3 of the country, you don't need any kind of excuse to vote by mail. You can just choose to. In Texas, you have to be eligible, you have to qualify, but our seniors qualify automatically. And so we sent applications out to those seniors and informed them of their right to vote by mail. And hundreds of thousands of them took us up on that and voted in a way that was safe for them. Well, these laws make it illegal for you to send those applications out as an election administrator to your voters. There are also, going back to some of these fights around the Civil Rights Act, a lot of what used to happen in the Jim Crow South was around voter intimidation. You might have had the right to vote, but if you showed up, there's going to be somebody standing there. They may have a firearm. And obviously that's going to intimidate you and make you think twice about voting. Well, these bills allow people to bring firearms into the voting centers. They allow poll watchers to essentially run rogue throughout the voting centers, and it makes it really hard to in any way regulate or discipline them. And look, I'm okay with poll watchers, right? For someone to come and be there and make sure everything is running smoothly. But the new laws make it impossible for, if they're doing bad stuff, if they're intimidating, even if they're videotaping you as you vote, which is a terrible invasion of privacy, they can't be disciplined in any way. And that's just plain wrong. You mentioned a moment ago, Matt, making it illegal to use Toyota Center as a voting center. That's true. And they try to, do that in sort of a hidden way. They, in the name of uniformity, they say every single voting center needs to have the exact same number of machines in it. Now, on its face, that doesn't sound too crazy. But if you think about the fact that a Toyota Center, if you were to use it, would have, 40, 50 voting machines. And then you have your small neighborhood library, where especially during a pandemic, you can probably only have 6 or 8 voting machines. Well, one of those would be illegal. You either couldn't have the big one or you couldn't have the small one, or most likely you wouldn't have either one. And so you're limiting where these voting centers can be. You can't have voting centers that are efficient for a lot of people to come in quickly, but you also can't have the one where most of our grandmothers and parents go to vote on a regular basis because it's right in their neighborhood. And there are so many other laws like this, things that are effectively poll taxes for people with disabilities, things that make it crimes to make small mistakes if you're a voter, if you're an election worker, or even if you're a government official who's doing your best to administer these elections. These are just terrible, terrible bills that are intended to stifle the right to vote. And again, that specifically target areas like big cities, Bill, where people of color and younger people are congregated. And that is not an accident. That is totally intentional. It's in line with efforts across this entire country to do the same state by state, especially in states that are starting to trend in a certain direction politically. And it's a huge problem. But your question, Matt, was, well, what can we do about it, right? For regular old citizens like me, we're kind of limited. We should be calling our state representatives, our state senators, our members of Congress, our governor, our lieutenant governor, and expressing our extreme displeasure with these racist and discriminatory laws. We should also be pressuring, like you mentioned, Carl, these corporate folks, like, you go back to 2020 and the NBA did a fantastic job, was leading on the forefront of saying, Black Lives Matter, and that we should be treating each other with respect and dignity as fellow citizens and as fellow human beings. That was great. I do have a question. And again, I remain a Rocket season ticket holder and all that, but are we going to step up now, right? And it's not just the league. I don't want to focus on just the league. Our stores and, companies here in Texas, HEB, very trusted family name that saved so many of us during the recent power outage, right? They have a strong policy on racial equity and diversity and inclusion. But this is probably the most important fight of this generation when it comes to racial equity and inclusion. And so HEB, where are you now? AT&T, where are you now? Southwest Airlines, United Airlines, American Airlines, all with big hubs right here in Texas. What are you going to do about this? And so as consumers, we have to sort of raise that temperature a little bit. And ultimately, if we're going to be challenged voting at the polls, we have to vote, with our wallets. But, coming back to you all as stars with big platforms, world champions, that leadership that was shown back in 2020, again, it just sets an example of what's possible. Using you all's platforms and setting that tone, others will follow you. And that certainly happened last year, and it can and should happen again. And so, I encourage you all to just continue to bang this drum, continue to share these messages publicly, and encourage those who are following you on social media and who looked up to you in the same way that I have their entire lives, to just be aware of what's happening and then take action to oppose it. And look, if they don't change those laws now, there's a couple things that can happen. One, let's vote them out next time, those people who are supporting, again, these racist and discriminatory acts. But also, again, folks should use that power of the purse. I'll give you an example from 2017. There was what was called the bathroom bill, legislation across the country that discriminated against members of the LGBT community. And Texas, folks rallied, including corporations, and stopped that law from ever being passed. That was great. We should try to do it again. Over in North Carolina, they actually passed these discriminatory bills. And then what happened? Well, the NCAA said, that championship that we were going to have in Charlotte, we're not doing it anymore. And other, companies that were going to make investments in North Carolina pulled them out. And then North Carolina changed this tune. They went back and they repealed those laws in order to bring that business back. And again, companies, members of our business community have that kind of power and that kind of influence right now. And we have to, put pressure on them, whether it's a good positive pressure or maybe, make it a little uncomfortable, but for them to do the right thing. And not even just because of the moral case for this, but for the business case. This is literally bad for business. There was a study back in 2017 that showed that states that had these discriminatory laws were going to lose billions and billions of dollars over the course of years. And I'm sure that that's the same here. And we're probably going to see a study in the very near future that shows that. And we just have to hold ourselves accountable, but ultimately do what's best for our society, for our businesses, for our jobs, but certainly for ourselves and our parents and our children.
My biggest issue is how bad this is, not only to America. And so the thing about it is that we have just decided that certain group of people say, I want to hold power over everyone. I don't care about your issues, whether it's race. I don't care about LGBTQ issues. I don't care about anything. The fact that I like my power, I want to do it that way. And if you think about it, by getting that power, what do? I change judges, I change rules, I change laws. And those laws are going so far as that now women are going to lose all the rights for their bodies. I mean, so it's so huge to make sure that we have everyone has the opportunity to vote. So technically they're voting for the rights of themselves and everyone else around us. It's just like COVID. We didn't wear masks just for ourselves. We wore masks for everyone else too. And that's what your right to vote is. And they're taking that right away from you. And that's something that affects everyone around us.
All right, guys, thank you so much. Chris, you've given us a lot to, a lot of instructions on what we should do. We all need to stand up. We all need to speak out. We all need to vote. We all need to go to the polls and make our voice heard, even if they're trying to keep us from voting. Let's all be sure that we go vote in all the elections and vote for representatives that represent us, that represent our values as Americans, where all men and women are created equal. And let's continue this fight against voter suppression. And so I thank all of you champions for joining us. It was great hearing your voices today. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for having me. Great seeing all of you. Thank you.